The next thing I want to talk with you about is how you can analyze whether you've actually done anything that's useful, because sometimes when we're doing performance optimizations, we can actually make the user experience worse. So what I'm going to do is, rather than pulling this up in development mode with my Chrome extensions showing up in the network tab like this, I'm actually going to pull up an incognito browser, and I'm going to go over here to where I gave you links to the production version of our code here. We have an exercise. I will copy that link address and paste it right here. And we also have a final. So this is the exercise version before we did code splitting. This is the final version after we did code splitting. I'll pull up my DevTools here and here. And I'm also going to pull up the coverage report, which we can get from these three dots here. Or you can do coverage to get the coverage from the drawer. And we'll do that same thing here. Okay, great. So now I'm going to click on the reload button from the coverage report here. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. And we'll notice that we're loading a handful of files more on this version than we do in this version. And that's because our final version has lazily loaded some code, and that code isn't necessary yet, so it hasn't shown up. And our exercise version is loading that code right from the get-go. This means that for the lazy loaded version, we're loading 1.1 megabytes of code, and that's JavaScript and CSS, before the user can see or interact with this checkbox. Whereas in the final version, after we've done this code splitting, we'll see that we've got 833 kilobytes of code before the user can see the checkbox. Now that's still quite a bit of code, but this is uncompressed. When we're talking about doing optimizations like this, the real thing you should be focusing on is the difference with the before and the after. So here we see before, we were loading that much, we're using 30% of it, and there's 768 kilobytes unused. Now we're loading this much, we've used 23% of it, and there are 644 kilobytes unused. What's interesting about this is that we've actually run a higher percentage of the code that we've loaded in the exercise version than we did in the final version. But that's actually not all that relevant. What really is relevant is that we loaded less code and we ran less code in the final version. So in the final version, we loaded 833. In the exercise, we loaded 1.1 megabytes. And in the final version, we ran 189 kilobytes. And then in the exercise version, we ran 337 kilobytes. So I would say that this code splitting that we've implemented is making a positive improvement to the speed at which our users are able to see and interact with our checkbox. So I would definitely leave this in place. If you want to take this a little bit further and see where you can optimize even more, then take a look at the usage visualization here, and you'll see that the red is the stuff that we haven't run. These files are sorted by size, and this top one for us is all of our dependencies that are required to get our app up and running. But as you can see, most of the code of our dependencies is not required to get our app up and running. So this could be one area where you could dive in a little bit deeper and see which of your dependencies you could code split further. You can even click on this and it will show you that file in your sources tab of your developer tools, showing you lines that are not run and lines that are run. And look, it looks like we've got a router in here that is not necessary for the user to be able to see this checkbox. So maybe there's something that we could do to lazily load that. And you can just keep on going through all of this minified code to try and identify which pieces of this code are not necessary for your users to start using your app. In review, what we did here is we pulled up the before page and the after page to compare what that initial load looked like for each of these use cases. We did this in incognito and in production so we can get a more correct picture of what our end users are experiencing, because they probably won't have the DevTools open, they won't have the Chrome extensions we have installed, and they absolutely will be using the production version of our application, which can have significant differences in the size of the code that we're loading. So it's important when you're looking at actual numbers and trying to compare and contrast that you're doing that comparison with all of the production optimizations that you have set up. I should note also that you can definitely do this all locally as well. There's no reason that you have to do it in production. So you could run your build and then serve it locally. Just try to get what you're actually testing to be as close to the end user's experience as possible so you can get more real numbers.